Today, we explore Jewish life during Prohibition, when the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages were banned in the United States. While the U.S. government granted religious exceptions for wine, both the reform and conservative movements distanced themselves from this, endorsing the use of grape juice instead. One contemporary posek passionately rejected grape juice and will examine the central arguments that shaped this debate. And as we'll see, this issue became a defining point for Orthodox Judaism in the early 20th century. Rabbi Yitzchak Simcha Halevi Horowitz, in 1926 in Yerushalayim, he published a sefer called Yad Halevi. This sefer Yad Halevi is a commentary on the Sefer HaMitzvahs LaHarambam, and we're going to be talking about a piece of his commentary on Mitzvah Kuf Nun Hey. Mitzvah Kuf Nun Hey is the mitzvah of Zachar Yom HaShabbos L'Kachay. But first, a word about this Rabbi Yitzchak Simcha Halevi Horowitz. He was born in Lithuania. He did not live in Eretz Yisrael. He lived in Hartford, Connecticut, and he was a rabbi there of a shul in Hartford. And in the back of the volume, he lists the names of all the Balabatim who gave him money to publish the book. Interestingly, I don't think this happened often. He went to Eretz Yisrael and published it in Yerushalayim. Maybe it was cheaper to print over there versus in New York. So that's when. And when he was there, he interacted with some of the Rabbanim who were there, as we're going to see later on. Okay, so that's the story of this Rabbi Horowitz. And he died a few years later. He died in 1935. So this is 9 years before he passed away. And we're going to be reading this passage of Mitzvah Kuf Nun Hey. He says as follows. Now that I finished saying what I had to say, I finished venting. I'm going to return to the words of the author that I'm critiquing. He wrote, his opening words are, Nidrashti la'asher sha'aluni rabbi v'chein shleimim. The unnamed author, we'll figure out who he is later on. This author began his tshuva by saying, I was asked by many people, many good Jews have been asking me a question. So I ask you, who's the one who's asking a religious question? Someone who's far from the Haredi Jewish religion. And in fact, Jews like you, he goes on to say, you already don't really observe Shabbos. You're asu Shabbat chemchel. You make your Shabbos like weekday. You haven't been making kiddush on wine in the past. Grape juice, and in the future you're not going to be making kiddush on grape juice. So why in the world is anyone asking you shaila in this area? I have no other choice but to assume that this is similar with the Maisa of the Arba Banim that we have in the Pesach Seder, where one of the four is the Rasha. And what's the Rasha's attitude? The Rasha's attitude is, Ma aveda azos lachem. What's Ma aveda azos lachem? What is this business you guys are doing? See, he turns to this author and he's saying, you are the Ben Rasha of the Haggadah, where you're also turning and saying, Ma aveda azos lachem. There's a certain ritual, and you're like, you're alienating yourself from it. Lachem v'loy loy. And that's what's really motivating you to write this tshuva, the fact that you don't like this ritual. And perhaps you thought that this is going to have hashpa on the leaders of this country who aren't Jewish, that maybe they will not give any more license to from Jews to be able to obtain shasiya kadas, legal beverages. It's not going to work. Praise to Hashem that the people, the American people that we're living amongst, they're Yesharim, they're Tzadikim, and they're not going to listen to what you have to say. And now once he began by calling the author of this tshuva a Rasha and linking him with the Rasha and the Haggadah who says, Ma aveda azos lachem, so he picks up on the same theme and says, and I did what the Haggadah says you're supposed to do with the Rasha. V'ani kiyamti b'zeh tshuvas bal ha'Haggadah ala she'ela azos. What are you supposed to do? What does the Haggadah tell you to do in response to the Rasha's question? Is you're supposed to hakei yashinav, you're supposed to knock out his teeth. Well, what I just did here in the work, again, with the passage we're reading right now is all the way at the tail end. But what I did overall in this work, I knocked out your teeth. And he concludes by saying, V'shalom al Yisrael. This is how Rabbi Yitzchak Simcha Levi Horowitz signs off on this area. As you can tell, this over here is dealing with a contemporary halachic issue. And it's interesting because when you think of a commentary on Sefer HaMitzvos, often you would imagine that this is lav dafke, it's practical halacha, relevant halacha. But Poyol, as much as it's a commentary on Sefer HaMitzvos, he also from time to time deals with halachic issues that are contemporary, that are relevant, lamaisa. And I have to tell you that from a quick browsing of different mitzvahs, he's not a big machmir at all, far from it. And yet, as we're going to see in this area, however, he has a very a firm point of view, as Rabbi Yitzchak Horowitz does, as we're going to be moving along. It's going to become clear. So what are we talking about here? What is the issue that is under discussion? This relates to the 18th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which was ratified on January 16, 1919. What happened on that day? On that day, the state of Nebraska accepted this amendment to the Constitution, making it the 36th state to have done so. And then you had the requisite 3/4 of states necessary in order to amend the Constitution. And what was the amendment? It reads as follows. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, so basically, starting from January 1920, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the United States for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. So from January 1920, no manufacturing, no sale, no transportation. It doesn't forbid drinking the alcohol, but it forbids all the things around it, the manufacture, the sale, the transportation, the import, the export of beverages. It's prohibited. And Congress and the states are going to have concurrent powers, which means they're going to have powers together to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So it's a very short amendment. Now you guys now go figure out and write up the law. It's important to know there are a nice number of amendments to the United States Constitution. And the most famous of them are freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of the press. All of these amendments are actually restricting the state from infringing on people's liberties. You quartering troops at people's homes, for example. So it's always, all the amendments essentially are limiting government. This is the one amendment, the one and only amendment that in fact, instead of limiting government, it actually limits human behavior. It takes away a freedom of a person. And I'm not. It's no surprise that it didn't last. And in 1933, it was eventually repealed. But where we are today, where before it was repealed, we're going to be hanging out in the 1920s when this issue was law. So the amendment was passed, and now Congress need to pass a law, which they did. The National Prohibition Act was passed on October 28, 1919, and this was over a veto of the president at the time. His name was Woodrow Wilson. And that means Congress, there was enough support in Congress, both in the Senate and in the House, to have enough votes to override the president's veto. Wilson was not a fan of this amendment, B'chlal, and so he tried to veto it, but it didn't go. Now, we're going to read just a few lines from this National Prohibition Act, otherwise known as the Volstead Act. He was the author of this legislation, and it says as follows. Nothing in this title shall be held to apply to the manufacture, sale, transportation, importation, possession, or distribution of wine for sacramental purposes or like religious rites. In simple English, this means prohibition is not going to impact religion. It's not going to take away a religious right. So sacramental wine, so there are, for example, Catholics use wine in their service, so that's something that we're not going to get in the way of. And obviously this applies to other religions as well. No person to whom a permit may be issued to manufacture for sacramental purposes, so any person who has reshus to create wine for religious purposes shall sell to any person who's not a rabbi, a minister of the gospel, priest, or any officer duly authorized for the purpose by any church or congregation. So yes, there's going to be religious exemption, but it has to all go through the religious clergy. So it's going to have to go through, if you have a permit to sell for religious purposes, it's going to have to go to a priest. It's going to have to go to a minister. The havdol is going to have to go to a Jew, etc., a rabbi, etc., etc. So this is the law, and it becomes good law in January of 1920. So right away, the question became for Jews, what's going to be with the wine that we need to use for halacha u'minig? And so right away, the Reform movement put out a responsa. It was written by Rabbi Julius Rappaport, and he wrote a piece that was published in 1920 titled Prohibition and Sacramental Wine Among Jews. And he writes as follows: is it absolutely necessary to use fermented wine that's alcoholic, in the Jewish ceremony or for Kiddush, Havdalah, grace, that's benching, and Bris Milah? Our answer to this must be in the negative, meaning it's not necessary to have a wine. Fermented wine is not essential, especially if wine is not easily obtainable. In fact, the following principle was established by the teachers, and they quote a Gemara. The Gemara in Baba Basra, Daf Tzadik Zayin Amud Beis says, one may press out the juice of grapes and use it immediately for Kiddush. The Gemara is saying over there is, you can squeeze your grapes, and then right away lift the glass and make Kiddush on this freshly squeezed grape juice. Obviously, is it alcoholic or anything like that? No. You literally just squeezed it a second ago, and yet it's mutter. Therefore, the rule may be safely followed that one may use grape juice. That's how it's spelled over there. Juice is G-U-I-C-E. Okay, so he's saying you could use grape juice. Now, in other words, yes, the government said you could use wine for sacramental purposes, but by the way, if you want to use grape juice, he's telling his people that this is something that they can do. Grape juice, you should know, was relatively new. It was invented by a man in New Jersey, in Violin, New Jersey. His name was Thomas Welch, and Welch's grape juice, which still exists today, it's the same company, he's the one who figured out in 1869 how to boil it and how to store it in a way that it doesn't ferment, which was beyond I'm not an expert in the production of grape juice or wine, so I don't know exactly what he was doing, but Kanida, it's more complicated than we think it was. He figured it out, and so we have grape juice. So this is on shelves now in America, and this Reform rabbi is telling people you could use it for religious purposes. Right away, there is a response in the Jewish media to this. So a Yiddish newspaper that came out in New York called the Yiddisches Tagblatt, and there's a poem written by a man named Yudman. I don't know who he is. And the title is called The Reformer und Arbe Koises. And we're going to be looking a few times today at the contemporary discussion about this issue as it appeared in the media at the time. So he writes as follows: Ich kann Reformer nicht verstehen. I don't understand the reform. Ich kann sie nicht erklären. I can't explain them. Warum sie suchen immer zu? Because they want to all over the place. Die frumme Iden stern. They want to disturb from Jews. Sie seien dach sich meilenweit. I think they are miles away von allem was ist Yiddish, from anything that's Jewish. Was mischen sie dem Zunge rein? Why are they mixing their tongue in? Auf was wir machen Kiddush, how we make Kiddush. Wer bet sie pasken an adin? Wie kommen sie zu dinim? Who's asking them to issue a ruling? What connection do they have to rulings? Halacha is far sie doch fremd. Halacha is foreign for them. The English far a greenem, just like English is for a greenhorn. So this is an expression in Yiddish. Someone who's new to America is called green, a greener, and so it's a term for alienation. And this is this person's macha to the Reform movement's responsa that was issued again in 1920. But at the end of the day, you still had this religious exemption, and Jews were utilizing it. And in fact, when you come to a year or so later after Prohibition started, by then, after you've done 12 months in Prohibition, you have a very good picture of what's going on. What's actually going on in America. And so the voice I want you to hear that I think encapsulates very well what's the Metzias on the ground is this satire that was written in a Yiddish newspaper in April of 1921 under the name of the pseudonym of Barney de Melamed. Apparently the guy his name was Leib Basen, a Yiddish writer, and he published a book called Barney de Melamed a few years earlier. And over here he wrote in their Volksadvokat, another Yiddish newspaper that came out in New York, he wrote a satire called Haggadah Shel Prohibition. And again, the value of this is you'll get a pretty good picture of what is actually going on 12 or 14 or so months after Prohibition has taken effect. So I'm not going to read the whole article. It's actually pretty funny, but we'll just do some pieces of it. So it begins with Baruch Atah Hashem Bir Chametz, right? So he starts Baruch Atah Hashem Asher Prohibishanu b'mitzvaysav. That was pretty cute. V'tzivanu al Bir Chametz. So he teaches what's al Bir Chametz und has al Bir Chametz gemacht. You made all the beer, you made it into chametz. Okay. Then he moves on to the simonim of the Seder, Kadesh. So what's Kadesh? Frume Yidden Megan Machen Kiddush. From Jews are allowed to make Kiddush. Und nit Frume können schein der Wahl genießen das Chus von der Frume. And people who aren't Orthodox, they're able to kind of piggyback on the Chus of the Frume. In other words, what he's satiring here is the fact that there were many Jews who weren't religious and didn't make Kiddush, but they could just say that they're making Kiddush, and then suddenly they could always have wine at home. Comes to Magid. Magid, Medarfner Zogen, so Magid means to tell, right? Medarfner Zogen, all you need to tell is a starke Kaffee. If you go to a cafe, say, I need a strong coffee. Und der Waiter weiß schon, was man meint. And right away the waiter knows if you say a strong coffee, this is what it means. This is the concept of the speakeasy, right? Where they're going to give you some bootleg liquor. Tzafun. So here, let's jump to Tzafun. Tzafun means hidden, right? The Unterschied from prohibition bis nicht prohibition is das behalten sich. The difference between prohibition and non-prohibition, before prohibition, was just whether it's concealed or not. Aber weiter trinkt man dieselbe Sache. We're drinking the same thing. It's the same alcohol consumption that was going on a year ago is going on now, but the difference is it's tzafun, now it's concealed. He moves on in the Agada Avodah Mayinu. He says, Alle seine versklavt. All of us are enslaved. Some of us are versklavt, enslaved to zum bitteren Trupp, that's alcohol. But some of us are enslaved to prohibition. In other words, either if you're breaking the law, so then you're enslaved to the alcohol. And if you're keeping the law, then you're enslaved to the law. Okay, Maisa Rebbe. Then he goes on to do Maisa Rebbe Elazar. And he basically says over here that there was a story with a Maisa with a rabbi, and not just one rabbi, but a whole bunch of rabbis. And right now, before Pesach, they had a convention in Washington. We know exactly what he's referring to. On April 14th, in Washington, D.C., 1921, the Reform Movement held their rabbinical convention. And let's see his report. He continues saying, and they came out against that the government has allowed the Arba Koisis and Kiddush and Havdalah business, giving it to Rabbanim, because they say this religious privilege leads to misbroicht. That's corruption. He's referring here to a man by the name of Rabbi Leo M. Frankel from Detroit, who gave a speech at this conference where he basically said that we need to advocate that Congress should repeal the religious exemption because of the fact that there's been too much scandal in terms of rabbis getting caught up in unethical behavior as it relates to this issue. And he goes on further to say, and it's not like Jews need it, we don't need it, because we could make Kiddush and use for Arba Koisis what he called unfermented wine. But he meant grape juice. And so there's no need for this exemption, and this was what he advocated. So this Barney de Malamid is satiring that by Maisa Berebi. Okay. The Agada continues, and we have B'shashesh Matzah Mara Munachan Lefanecha. That's when we do the mitzvah of Pesach. So he says, Norven the Matzah Mara Ligan Tish is when a person's supposed to be drinking the wine. Vasat aber getan meine Irische Schachin. What did my Irish neighbor do? Hat weggelegt die Matzah Mara und getrunken. So he's like, okay, so the Irish guy now puts down the Matzah Mara and he starts drinking. This is alluding to the fact that many non-Jews basically said, I'm also Jewish or whatever it is, and they would get their hands on some alcohol. Wie kommt ein Irischer zum Matzah Mara and Arba Koisis? What does an Irishman have anything to do with the Seder? So is the Tiritz ve'erev Rav. No, remember the story of the Exodus where you have the erev Rav. Punkt wie amol wenn die Iden seiner Reis von Mitzrayim. Und zu say zugestanden an erev Rav von Goyim. Just like then they had an erev Rav. Also ich sage euch jetzt, wenn die Iden gehen Reis von Klau Prohibition, L'chavit Pesach, when we're leaving, we're having an exodus, a redemption from Prohibition. In honor of Pesach, stehen zu say an erev Rav, so we get an erev Rav, so that explains all the Gentiles. V'lo yadei saraf, weiter in the Agada, you say the lo yadei saraf. So yayin saraf is a term that we always use for hard liquor. So was is besser bekannt durch Rashi Tevis yash. So lo yadei saraf, prohibition, the religious exemption doesn't apply to yayin saraf. Git men nit for sacramental purposes. So you don't have sacramental purposes, it's only for wine. That's what he assumed at the time. Many assumed that because the legislation literally uses the word wine. The Volstead Act, it says wine. It doesn't say. So people assumed that it was only wine, and that's what the Catholics need. And so that was the assumption. But Poyol, there was a Jew who got a note from his rabbi that he needed brandy for sacramental purposes, and his name was Emanuel Schwartz. And this was a court case in Washington, D.C. after this article was published in 1922. He had 50 barrels of brandy that were confiscated. He sued. He said, what do you mean? I have a psak din from a Rav that I could use this for religious purposes. And he won. So I don't know what the follow-up to that was, but that's the reference here, Loya de Saraf. Okay, V'mayra Gadol. So the Yitzias Mitzrayim happens b'mayra Gadol. So he says, as von deswegen is a große Meira inside from Prohibition. You have to be very afraid. What do you have to be afraid of? So later, the same Pasha speaks about the Gilui Shechina. So he puns Gilui Shechina, the neighbor. The Shechina is only megala zayin that the neighbor shouldn't rat you out. Okay, then you come to the end of the Seder and you have the Echad Miyadea. So you go Shloisha Miyadea. Who knows three? Drai Vesich. Dry is it's in America. Now in America it's dry. Nit of Yiddish, not of English, dry. Not in Yiddish, but but in English, dry. Because, right, okay. Chad Gadya. So von deswegen spielen sich mit Prohibition torment. Don't play around with Prohibition. For man kann gehen in Chad Gadya, you're going to get sent to Chad Gadya. It's a Yiddish expression for prison. Okay, this is a little bit of a good comedy, but it also gives you a little picture, just with this one article, of 1 year later, what actually is going on. And this was very widely known at the time, that there was a lot of problems associated with this law, or at least the enforcement of this law. So now let's fast forward to 1922. In 1922, we have in the Yiddish Gazetten an article by a man by the name of Getzel Zelikovic. And Getzel Zelikovic is going to tell us something, a change that happened within the conservative movement. We haven't spoken about them yet. That happens now. Remember, the Reform, they wrote something right away. 1920, right away they wrote. Conservative didn't write anything then. But that's going to change in 1922, and he's writing about this in October of 1922. He goes, merhaben nais, we have news. Unsere Doktorin der Philosophie, so in other words, a professor, haben sich genommen zu schreiben, Shaus Tshuvas and Lashon Kodesh. They started writing a responsa in Hebrew. A responsum in Hebrew. The alte Nusach von der Rishonim und Achronim. Who's this person he's referring to? Dr. Louis Ginsburg, who's the professor of Gemara in Schechter's Rabbanim Seminar in New York. That's the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, associated with the conservative movement. Schreibt sich nicht unter Eufen Vaterblatt, Dr. L. Ginsburg. He doesn't write on the title page that he's Dr. Ginsburg or Professor Ginsburg. This is what he writes. He has his name, and he says, Me'ez Levi ben Moirenu Harav Yitzchak Lebeis Ginsburg, Nin v'neched lahagoyin achosid Avram, achi hagoyin mivilna. This is absolutely true. The title page has his name, it says Levi, and basically he says, by the way, my Elta Zayda was a brother of the Gra. Hastes, as marhaben dazu tamit mechaber ayachsen, we're dealing with someone with great lineage. So if that's the case, then we're gonna even the finest details, we're gonna have to quibble with him. And what he basically does is, this Zelikovic was a master in Hebrew, and he had his own shittas and writing Hebrew. Remember, this is 1920. This is relatively new, and so he basically, instead of dealing with the substance of Ginsburg's arguments, he critiques his Hebrew and like 15 different, like this is wrong and this is wrong with the language. Then he goes, Verstehe ich nicht, I don't understand why Dr. Louis Ginsburg is not happy with his yichus on the title page alone. He mentions Doidi Skeni Hagra 6 times in the Sefer. It's like calm down with your uncle. You know, it's like you're very, very far if you go back to the generations, but he's like 6 times. Okay. Here's the main point, though, that I think many people probably felt at that time, and that's in this final paragraph of this article. If Dr. Ginsburg wollte in sein Shaus Tshuvas gesucht zu beweisen, als mit grape juice ist man yotze b'diavad kiddush, havdalah, shava brachas und so weiter. If he wanted to show that b'diavad it works, wo man zu ihm nicht gekannt haben ernste Teines. You're not going to be able to come to him with serious complaints. Will aber beweisen, als eigentlich lechatchila is man yotze mit alle grape juice. He wants to show that it's not b'diavad, he wants to show us lechatchila, and that's where we have this problem. So again, this article was published in October of 1922, but and a few weeks or months before that, he published his tshuva as something that you could buy, a 70-page little booklet. But already January of 22, the conservative movement had a meeting in JTS in Manhattan, and they basically announced that they're going to be issuing a tshuva on this issue, and that they're basically changing their position. Why are they changing their position? So we already saw before a little bit that the reformers were concerned about some unethical behavior. Well, in the months that followed, things became a little out of hand. So let's look at a few examples. Here's from the New York Times, March 30, 1921. The title of the article, the headline is, "Find Wine in Rabbi's Home. Buffalo Dry Agent sees 40 gallons and arrests woman." So what's the Maisa? It came out here today that Rabbi Avram Franklin of William Street, when his church business is done, remember in the early period they called shuls, churches, becomes chief financial officer in Columbia Wine Company with offices in his home. When Rabbi Franklin is out, his wife Rebecca attends to business. Rabbi Franklin was out yesterday when dry agent William Cohn called and obtained a bottle of Jewish sacramental wine for $1. Mrs. Franklin did not ask to see the permit from an Orthodox rabbi, which would make the transaction within the pale of the Volstead law. That's that act that we read earlier. The dry squad descended upon the house, seized 40 gallons of wine containing 6% alcohol, arrested Mrs. Franklin for a violation of the Volstead Act. So this is in the New York Times. Is getting a lot of attention, where there is what looks like improper behavior, where rabbis and the clergy or rabbis are involved in illegal bootlegging under the cover of sacramental wine. What do you want to say? 6%. Are you saying 6%? So Rabbi's not impressed. Okay, I hear you. Now, there was this individual by the name of Jacob Sonderlin who wrote a shtickle autobiography. It's called 5 Gates, Casual Notes for an Autobiography. And he writes about the fact that he was a rabbi of a Chicago shul in the 1920s. And he writes like this: "A member of my congregation's board brought me the newest list of our membership and asked me to sign it. What do you need my signature for? In all innocence," he explained, "every synagogue member, according to American law, is entitled to 5 gallons of sacramental wine. The congregation is buying that wine, on behalf basically of all these members, from the government at a cheap price, selling it afterward at a very high price to all the people." And the way I understand all the people, meaning anyone, whoever we choose to sell it to. Remember, not everyone in shul needs wine, and not everyone in shul needs that much wine. And doing great business. Of course, I refused to do that, and my congregation was upset. He doesn't say this here, but I'll translate their upsetness. But the shul down the block is doing it, so why can't we do it? It's a good way of raising revenue. My friend Shmaya Levin, he was a big macher in the WZO at the time. He said once that Orthodox rabbis doing big business in those days in sacramental wine had changed the Tehillim. Tehillim 121 says, "Me'ayin yavai ezri." Levin suggested instead of me'ayin, read miyayin. Miyayin yavai ezri, because of the fact that this was a very lucrative thing. Okay, there's a ton of stories. There was a Maisa with the Menorah Wine Company that happened. Big scandal, covered for many months in the newspapers, and there was a lot of this. And this is what basically prompted the conservative movement to say, let's take a second look at this. And in 1922, they have their greatest Talmud professor, Louis Ginsburg, issue this tshuva that essentially said grape juice is okay, lichatchila, but 100% lichatchila. Okay, so, and that's the background to the rabbi we began with, Rabbi Horowitz, who was very upset. And he was talking about, you guys don't even make Kiddush. You didn't make Kiddush on wine before. You're not going to make Kiddush on grape juice tomorrow. Ma avodah zos lachem and all that. So his anger here is directed at Louis Ginsburg. And that explains that. And now what we want to do is we want to actually get a little into the substance of what the discussion was. So we're going to focus on one point that Ginsburg wrote and addressed, that Rabbi Horowitz addresses as well. He doesn't go through all of Ginsburg's points. He focuses most of his energy on this one issue, and that is a statement of the great Magen Avram, the commentator to the Shulchan Aruch, lived in the 1600s, and much of the halachic discussion revolves around that. So let's have a look. So the Shulchan Aruch, in Orach Chaim Simin Reish Ayin Beis, reads as follows: if you have wine that's freshly pressed from a gas, from a press, you can make Kiddush right away. The Seichet Adam Eshkol Shal Harav, you could squeeze out a cluster of grapes, and you can make kiddush right away. So again, this fresh wine, even it didn't ferment, it didn't sit, it didn't anything, it's not yain yashan, it's kosher for kiddush. This is what it says in the Shulchan Aruch based on the Gemara. Remember, we saw that the Reform Responsa quoted this Gemara before. Says the Magen Avram on this. Hold on. If you want to know what the mitzvah is, which he means over here, mitzvah, he means what's the mitzvah min hamufchar, what's the optimal way of doing the mitzvah, is yain yashan. Yain yashan means it sat, it fermented. By definition, it's alcoholic. So that's better. And the Alter Rebbe, who relies a lot on the Magen Avram, quotes this in the same Siman Reish Ayin Beis, and he adds a few words. Why is it a mitzvah b'yayin yashan shehu meshubach yaiser? Because it is better. The Magen Avram addresses this in another place, in Erech Chaim Siman Tov Reish, dealing with the issue of shehechiyanu on Rosh Hashanah. So we know that on the second night of Rosh Hashanah, there's a doubt, are we supposed to make Shehechiyanu or not? So the safest thing to do is to say Shehechiyanu on a pre-Chadash. Truth is, instead of a pre-Chadash, there's another option. That is, you can have a Yayin Chadash. Just like you can make a Shehechiyanu on a pre-Chadash, you could have a Yayin Chadash. By Yayin Chadash, by definition, means it's freshly pressed wine. It's mamish new. So here's how the Magen Avram tells us what to do, how to handle this situation. In Yesh like Tirosh Chadash, if you have Tirosh is this young wine, it's fresh wine. So, and the reason you want to use it on the second night Rosh Hashanah is for Shehechiyanu purposes. This is how to do it. Yikadesh ala yayin yasha. Make kiddush on the regular wine, the aged wine. Ukeshiagia l'Shehechiyanu, and when it comes to Shehechiyanu, so then yital atirish biyadai. Then lift the second glass of the yayin chadash of this new wine. That's what you should do. And he quotes it from earlier sources. But why? Why am I saying this? L'chayra min adin, just hold the fresh wine, just hold the tirosh, and make kiddush on it, and make a shehechiyanu on it, and it's wonderful. So he says, although min adin, a person is allowed to make kiddush on a young wine, makomaka yashan is mitzvah min hamuvchar, and it's important to do the mitzvah min hamuvchar. So it's important to do the mitzvah min hamuvchar, so therefore you make kiddush on the aged wine, and then you'll touch or hold. Some places can say you don't even need to do that. You can just look at it, look at the tirosh, but don't make kiddush on the tirosh. Now, if you take these sources together, you can make a very, very strong argument that says that it's really, really important in Judaism to have yayin yashan. Ad kedei kach, that even on Rosh Hashanah, when there's a halachic need to have new wine because of your Shehechiyanu issue, Aval B'Kain, even there, we're like, no, yeah, you have that need, but no, kiddush needs to be on yayin yashan. So it's like, oh, okay, this sounds really, really important. Which is why the Magen Avram says that as much as the Gemara says you could squeeze your grapes and drink it fresh, yeah, but that's not mitzvah. That's the din, but it's not mitzvah min ha mufchar. So what happens is Louis Ginsburg deals with this, and what he wants to say is that this is all one big misunderstanding. That the Magen Avram, who highlights that it's a mitzvah min ha mufchar to use yayin yashan, aged wine, it's one big misunderstanding. If you go back to the earlier sources that discuss this Rosh Hashanah issue, you'll see he argues, you'll see Rabbi Horowitz vehemently disagrees. But Louis Ginsburg was saying that if you go back to the earlier sources, you'll see that lav dafka, it's a mitzvah min hamufchar to use yayin yashan. So what's this earlier source? It's Maril. So let's have a look at Maril. Maril and Hilchas Rosh Hashanah, this is the great Rishon from Mainz, who lived in the late 1300s, early 1400s, and he has this famous sefer, the Minhagim. Zman shemavarchim b'leil sheni de Rosh Hashanah, regarding Shehechiyanu that we make on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, second night of Rosh Hashanah. Darash Ma'ari Segal. Remember, his student is the one who wrote the sefer, so that's why it's written in this way. So Ma'ari Segal, Rabbi Yaakov Segal, he was a Levi, says as follows. This is what you do. Yasek kol kiddush hakois yayin yashan. You make kiddush on the aged wine, v'lo yatirosh, not on the fresh wine. Why? What's the reason? Tirosh, if you make a hagafen on young wine, on a tirosh, it's not going to be moitzi an aged wine. Kedisa be Yerushalmi, as it says in the Yerushalmi, if you started on young wine, and then you got aged wine later on in the meal, you need to make a second bracha, even though you already made a bracha on the young wine. We don't paskin like this. We don't do this. But the way the Maril is quoting a Yerushalmi says that if a person makes a bar priya gafen on a fresh wine, a young wine, and then later on in the meal you bring yayin yashan, so you need to make a new bracha. Continues the Mariel. The Chiva, and why is that relevant to what we're talking about here? Because Chiva and the Yain Yashan Koiveya Bracha La'atzmai. Because here we see, now that we see that Yain Yashan, at least according to this Yerushalmi, deserves its own bracha, and the Tirosh doesn't satisfy in terms of the bracha. So what does that show us? That shows us that Yain Yashan is chashavhu umuktam lekiddush. That shows that this Yain Yashan is very, very important, which is why it takes precedence that you should use it for kiddush. Okay, so let me tell you how Rabbi Horowitz understands the pshat here, and it seems that taka is the pshat over here. The pshat here is, what do we see from this Yerushalmi? We see from this Yerushalmi that Yain Yashan is better. How do I see from this? Now, the truth is, do I really even need this Yerushalmi? How many times do Chazal speak about the value of Yain Yashan? There's a Gemara in Kedushin that it says that if you have a slave, you need to treat him well. If you're drinking Yain Yashan, then you need to give him Yain Yashan. It says, don't give him Chadash while you have Yain Yashan. Clearly telling you Yain Yashan is preferred. Or when Yosef sends the gift, he's sending Yain Yashan to Yaakov. So clearly it's preferred. But fine. But we're looking here to show, like, even halachically, where do you see in halacha it's preferred? So the Mariel points to the fact that we're going to, theoretically, at least there's a viewpoint that says, even when I'm passing like this Lamaisa, that a bracha on a young wine doesn't mitzi the old wine, the aged wine. So what does that mean? What does that show you? The aged wine is really a davar chashuv. Oh, so now that you need to come and you need to make kiddush, so it makes so much sense to make kiddush on the aged wine. You should make kiddush on the aged wine because it's preferred. You need a shechianu, fine, but it doesn't. It's so important to make kiddush on the aged wine. Make it on the aged wine, and you'll deal with the tirosh later. Good. So did the Magen Avram do a good job by extracting a principle over here? It sounds like the Magen Avram did a great job. That yes, the Gemara says you could squeeze and make kiddush, but that's not mitzvah min hamufchar. Mitzvah min hamufchar is to use yain yashan. Louis Ginsburg, however, understood this Mariel differently. What he says is, no, the whole thing is because of a bracha. The Yerushalmi is talking about the Yerushalmi that Mariel brings is about a bracha. In other words, if you're going to make kiddush on the young wine, and then you're going to later in the meal you're going to bring an aged wine. So now we're going to get into a shaila about a bracha. I don't want to get into a shaila and a bracha. So therefore, the Mariel tells me that you should just make it on the old wine. You make it on the aged wine. So then we're not going to have a shaila and a bracha later on. So it's only a shaila in dinei brachas. But if you tell me in the beginning of the meal, by the way, I'm not bringing any wine later in the meal. You're not bringing any wine later in the meal, so then gesundheit. Then it's the second night of Rosh Hashanah. Make kiddush lechatchila on the tirosh, on the young wine, because it's not going to be a shaila later of a new bracha or not. And if that's the pshat, if Louis Ginsburg is right, then you can't extract from there anything about a mitzvah min hamufchar. It's simply an issue of bracha. But again, I probably biased you already. But when you read it inside, it doesn't sound like it's saying that, because it sounds like he's saying that from the Yerushalmi I see that theoretically it would need a new bracha. What does that tell me? That tells me that it's like a min b'fnei atzma, that it's a chashuv b'yoser. And as Mariel concludes the thought, v'chivin de'yayin hayashan kovea bracha la'atzma, because of bracha, here's his point. Therefore chashuv hu muktam lekiddush. Therefore it's muktam lekiddush, even if you're not going to use any wine later on. So that's Pashtus what it is, and that's why Rabbi Horowitz gets very enraged that Louis Ginsburg's like the Magen Avram had a misunderstanding. It's hard to understand where you see here a misunderstanding. Okay, so that's a small taste, but I think of a central piece that's going on over there, revolving around this: is the Magen Avram right or incorrect? Correct or incorrect when he says mitzvah min hamufchar on yayin yashan? And Louis Ginsburg does something that is not typically done, and it's to say that no, if you look back, definitely not in traditional way of learning, is to say, oh, one big mistake and kind of brush it away. And Rabbi Horowitz was not too thrilled with that. But then what Louis Ginsburg does, he does another thing. He says, even according to the Magen Avram, he says like this, and here Horowitz quotes it. Bevadai hoya moida. Here, these are Louis Ginsburg's words. Bevadai hoya moida shetoiv yosef lekadosh al yayin chadash. Even if, let's say, it is mitzvah min hamufchar to use yayin yashan, but what's better? To use yayin chadash, grape juice, and have no chilul Hashem in America, or to use yayin yashan but to have a chilul Hashem? Says even the Magen Avram would say this is a case where you don't do mitzvah min hamufchar, do a b'diavad. Says Rabbi Horowitz, I agree. You're going to notice the sarcasm in a second. It's true, if you have no other choice, you're allowed to use freshly pressed wine. And I agree, it's better even if you have yain yashan, it's better to be mekadesh al yain megite miliyos lidiba lachenu hakroim, to be slandered by our siblings, the kroim. So the kroim, what he's doing over here earlier in the tshuva, the kroim are the Karaites. So this is a medieval group that splintered off from the Jews. So he's using the same term just with an ayin, and he's like kara maloshin tiring, because they're tearing away from the Jewish people. So he calls them, the conservatives, he calls them kroim. So he says, soineinu umin adenu ha'ela hamavishim esrachenu bein agoyim shchenenu. The non-Jews, they're great. They're yanichu l'chol am leilach b'shem lekov. They allow everyone to follow their religion. But it's our brothers that are getting in the way. And I would prefer to actually make kiddush on grape juice, theoretically, to make kiddush on yayin chadash. He was saying to stop the chil Hashem, and I'm saying to avoid the harassment and the chil Hashem that they're making by attacking us. Okay, fine. So now we're in agreement. We're basically in agreement. So you said that you're okay with yayin chadash. If you're in difficult situation, you describe it one way, you could describe it another way, but we're in agreement right now. So let's just go ahead and hold hands and make kiddush on grape juice and call it a day. He continues, Achein, ha-grape juice, eino yayin megitoi. No. Grape juice is not wine that's coming fresh from a press. Why? The yayin megitoi ta'amoi v'reicha yayin. Wine from a press smells and tastes like wine. The gam yeshlai ma'at mechoizak alcohol, and it has a little bit of alcohol in it. Nishmas hayayin, which is the soul of the wine, hasoyed v'hamisameach u'ma'oireres halev, that which makes us sated, makes us happy, and inspires the heart. Umahai time, and therefore, if a kohen drank yayin megitoi, fresh wine, hu muzar lebli lekadim samikdash, you're not allowed to go into the Beis Hamikdash. In other words, wine freshly pressed, for all intents and purposes, is halachic wine. Aval grape juice ain by tam yain klal. Grape juice doesn't have any taste of wine. Vafilu reach yain ain by, it doesn't even smell like wine. So therefore, lekuli alma ain makachin alav. According to all opinions, this is not something we should be making kiddush on. And he quotes Shulchan Aruch Simin Reish Ayin Beis. The only din I see in Simin Reish Ayin Beis that may be connected is it says you're not allowed to make kiddush on wine shereichoi ra, that has a negative foul smell. So he's expanding it. Foul smell, you can learn two ways. One is the smell spoiled, but he understands it broader. Reichai ra means if you don't smell like wine. If you don't smell like wine, then reichai ra. Grape juice doesn't smell like wine, so therefore it's out. And he goes so far as to say that grape juice is not Beire Pri Hagafen. And he quotes Orach Chaim Siman Reish Dalet. The only thing I could find in Orach Chaim Siman Reish Dalet that could justify this is it says if people aren't drinking a wine because it's so vinegary, so then you make a shahakol, you don't make a Beire Pri Hagafen. So he's applying that here, even though grape juice isn't vinegary, but just like vinegar is not wine, so then grape juice, he decided, is also not, and so therefore, just like vinegar isn't Bar Pri Hagafen, this too shouldn't be Bar Pri Hagafen. Then he goes on to say, even Yaim Avoshol, there's a big machlokes of the Rishonim, and some people say that cooked wine, this is wine that does have alcohol content, because it was able to ferment, but it was also cooked. Some say that you don't make a Bar Pri Hagafen and you're not allowed to use it for Kiddush. So Kol Shekain, now we don't paskin like that, but there is such a view. So Kol Shekain, Bahani, Kiyua, Da'anvein, this acid of grapes, that's what he calls grape juice, the Nishtana, Ligarusa, Lagamri, that's completely diminished in quality, V'nitul Menu Chaskai, Tama V'rechai, and its oomph, its taste, and its smell have been removed. L'kuli Alma, Eim Avarchan Ol Bar Pri Hagafen, everyone's going to agree with me. No Bar Pri Hagafen, no Kiddush, no Dalet Kaises, no dinim of Stam Yenam or anything involved like that. This thing isn't wine. So therefore, he's like, yeah, I could agree. B'shas Hatchak, you can make Kiddush on Yayin Chodosh. I agree. And maybe you could count Prohibition with the situation with the conservative movement harassing us. Maybe we could count that B'shas Hatchak. For what? For Yayin Chodosh. Grape juice is not Yayin Chodosh. This is his point, and then he concludes the tshuva with the paragraph that we opened up with. Again, this is 1926 when he published the Sefer. Presumably, he wrote this sometime between 1922 and 1926. I don't know exactly what year. What's interesting is we don't really have a lot of writing from Rabbanim about this issue during this period. And the simplest reason for that is because the status quo was fine, meaning the government never took away the religious exemption. They cracked down on scams, but ultimately the permission, the underlying permission was always there. So I don't know that Rabbanim felt that it was necessary to call more attention to themselves by writing a tshuva or whatever it is, when it's mutter or whatever it is. But it's not a tshuva that he wrote. He's writing a commentary on Sefer Mitzvahs. Sometime in between those years, in 1922 and 26, he wrote this piece. And so in that regard, he becomes kind of the person, if you want to look back to the frum rabbi that spoke about this issue, he's the one we turn back to. Now apparently one of the Gdoilei Harabanim of the day, who was the chief rabbi of the Av Bezin in Yerushalayim already at the time, Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank, saw what he wrote. Now remember I said before that he traveled to Yerushalayim, the Sefer was published in Yerushalayim. Years later, in the Shalos HaShuvas Har Tzvi, Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank has a letter that's published there that appears to be a response to Rabbi Horowitz. However, as far as I can tell, this response was not made public in the 20s or the 30s. It was published way later. But it seems to have been written then. And it says as follows. Grape juice. So you, Rabbi Horowitz, you're getting involved in writing about grape juice. And you going to battle on he who said that it's permitted to make kiddush on grape juice. With respect to the fact that you disagreed with him for saying, sorry, let me read that again. In this that he, Ginsburg, disagreed with the view that says that it's mitzvah namuch l'kadosh alav, that it's preferred to use yain yashan. Absolutely, you are right. Ginsburg should have not attacked the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram stands correct. Who, in their right mind, is going to say and go against the Magen Avram who said it's preferred to use yain yashan? This you say that you shouldn't make hagafen. The ain mekatchen alav, you're not allowed to use it for kiddush. L'chayra hifrid is alamida here. You're going more than necessary. You're jumping the gun, because in the Shulchan Aruch we paskin like the Rosh, the yayim of Hoshul, you do make bayer pri hagafen, and you're allowed to make kiddush on it. Number one. Number two, when you squeeze grapes right away, so here's two things we know halachically. One thing, you squeeze grapes, right away you can make kiddush. Here's another thing we know, that if you cook the liquid, you also can make kiddush. So what's the difference? And now you're going to say, yeah, but grape juice, you squeezed it and cooked it in such a way that you didn't let it to become alcohol, you did it very quickly. So he says, Menale de bishul take of leschitas hanav and garas fei. How do you know that because you cooked it right away before it started fermenting, how do you know that that's worse? What's your raya? What's your raya? It's like, I don't know. You're going to say that's usher for kiddush. You're going to say it's usher for agafen. And so therefore he disagreed. Usher for kiddush, and then you don't make a ber per agafen, and therefore he disagreed. And this basically becomes a discussion that comes out later years after Prohibition was repealed. And that's when you start seeing Rabbanim, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. That's when everyone has a tshuva, what their view is on grape juice. And I think most people assume that grape juice is hagafen, and most people assume it could be used for Kiddush and Havdalah. The shaila is, how exactly are you going to word it? How exactly are you going to word it? I think also most people assume that yayin yashan, if fermented wine is preferred. But what does that mean? And how are you going to word it? That's where I think, but many Rabbanim discussed it in the subsequent years. I'm less interested in that part of the discussion, at least for now and for our purposes. I will say that during Prohibition, it does seem like this was an issue. Like you're always looking for, we're people that we like to have very clear lines. Like, what's the difference between us and conservative? And it does seem like this, remember, this is before their heter to drive on Shabbos. So this is before their shoals are mixed, as far as I think. I think that's correct. And so you're looking for things. And this was one of those things. It's like, they're the people who do the grape juice. And so I think that becomes an interesting thing in terms of how it was seen at that time. Okay, I want to conclude with two things. Number one, there's one or two famous incidents in where the Rebbe was involved in something related to grape juice. So number one, the famous thing is in Tav Shalom and Ches. When the Rebbe had a heart attack on Leil Shmini Atzeres, the Rebbe made Kiddush that night. And it's a well-known story that's said often that they offered the Rebbe grape juice, and the Rebbe declined to make Kiddush on grape juice that evening and instead made Kiddush on wine. So that, I think, is rather famous. There's another story that Rabbi Groner relates, and that has to do with Shabbos Parshas Balak, Tavshin Chav Dalet. This was a Fabrengen, if I recall correctly, Shivas or B'Tammuz the fast was going to be on Sunday. And but there was a surprise Fabrengen in 770, and at this Fabrengen the Rebbe was very, very freilich and encouraged a lot of l'chaim. And Ad Kadei Kach that said we should empty everything that's in the building. So according to the story that Rabbi Groner said, was that later that evening the Rebbe was needed to make Havdalah in 770 apparently, and so they said there is no wine left. So he offered the Rebbe grape juice, and the Rebbe said, "Vuas is gehert geworden to make Kiddush on Havdalah or Havdalah on grape juice." And so he went over to Rabbi Meir Itkin's house and got wine. I don't know exactly where these are stories that we've heard, and so I'm just putting it out there for the record. I want to conclude now with a letter that the Rebbe wrote on the theme of prohibition, meaning the Rebbe didn't write it on the theme of prohibition. On the theme of prohibition, I would like to conclude with a letter that the Rebbe wrote in Tavshin Yud Gimel, Ches Kislev, to Rabbi Peretz Mochkin from Montreal. And the Rebbe writes as follows. L'daiti, my opinion, mitzad shnei inyanim, because of two factors, nishtana hamatzav be'az. The situation is different from the way it was in Russia. Shahaya minig revach inyan shsiyas hamashka b'shufi. There used to be a widespread custom that there was a lot of mashka drinking in Russia. And the situation here has changed now for two reasons. Number one, ki ditnu kvar hakoyches la'anash, the Hasidim have the ability, have the power, ayidei roiv ha'mamorim hakalim, through the many simpler maimorim, ve'asichis, and the sichis, b'inyanim shal hasbara v'avana, that are well explained. So because we have that great toolkit, so therefore we could lifat al hashayim, and we'll be able to impress the listeners mebli sheyu skukin lamashka b'shufi, without needing tons of mashka. V'dai maspik gam hama'at shebezeh, and the little of mashka should be sufficient, and we don't need more. So in other words, Rabbi Peretz Mochkin was writing to the Rebbe about the need to say a lot of l'chaim in order to lead a good fabrengen. The Rebbe was like, today when we have so many sichas and so many marim, that I think he's saying could A, inspire you, B, become material for you to share, so it makes the fabrengen much more simpler, and we don't need this mashka. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, kivin shebizmana achrein, in recent times, beyichud especially, nidrush me'etanu ba'adgashi yaseder, we need with extra emphasis the inyan da'afasas hamayanas chuta, spreading the wellsprings of Hasidus and Judaism outward to the whole world. Hine olul inyan ashufi demashke levavo lezebi yoser. However, being inebriated or a culture of inebriation can get in the way of that, and this wasn't so relevant when we were on our own Dalet Amis, when we were doing Afatas Hamayanos amongst Hasidim and Anash. Then the Rebbe adds and says, I am relying also on, for the first point, from something I heard from my father-in-law, the Fidik Rebbe in Latvia, where he said, Ich bin itzter wie noch a bissel mashka. I am now like after a little mashka. And the Rebbe clarifies, when he said itzter, he didn't mean that 1 minute, but he meant during that whole tkufa. I'm like the whole time, it's as if I had a little mashka. So the Rebbe goes on and says, even though the Tamach Hitzoni, the plain reason for this was the physician said that he cannot take l'chaim, but that's only an external reason. So that's only for people who are external people. But us we're Hasidim, so we look for the inside of everything. We look for the pnimius, and the pnimius is that it wasn't because of the physicians. The Fidik Rebbe was saying something deep over here, that I could be nach mashke without any after mashke. As the letter continues, this is also a lesson for all of us, because gufa basar reshagar, the body follows the head. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is the head. Chasidim are nigroim achrei nesienu, after the Frierdiker Rebbe. And that means that we also now could be nacha bisol mashka. And this is a lesson for all Hasidim, that we could be in this situation. And again, the Rebbe links this to the first of the 2 points, which means because there's so much content, there's so much chassidus, there's so much more, there's so much that could enter our brains and enter our heart, so then that type of high, that type of kick in the pants, that type of motivation, that type of, I don't care what people are saying, that type of stimulation, all that, you can get it from these sources, and we don't need it from the mashke. And so therefore the Rebbe was trying to teach about a culture of being careful about not drinking too much, in this letter to Hasidim who were used to something else in Russia. I'll also add that in today's Rambam, in Perek Echad, so it mentions about in the Beis Avelos, it mentions over there that there was times that there was too much drinking going on, and so the Chachamim made a takana limiting drinking. So 10 cups. To 10 cups. 10 cups of wine. Yeah. So what you see over here is prohibition in America came from somewhere. Whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, I think pretty much people agree. But it came from somewhere, and the place it was coming from, the motivation. There's a lot that's right there. There's a lot that's important there, and there's a lot for us to think about there. And l'chaim.